Get off the floor, Elisa. You're a disgrace. Marcus hissed, adjusting his custom silk tie. He ignored the dark blood gathering at her split lip. Elisa tasted copper. She pressed trembling palms against the cold marble, desperately trying to obey the father who should have protected her. Every breath felt like jagged glass, grinding in her ribs. She had been beaten and broken so often she'd forgotten what safety felt like. I said, "Get up." Marcus raised his heavy hand again. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors splintered inward with a deafening crack. Alpha King David stepped through the ruins. His dark, suffocating gaze locked onto Elisa, then slowly shifted to Marcus. "Drop your hand." David's voice was a seismic, terrifying rumble that shook the crystal chandelier. "Or I will sever it from your wrist." The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Thorne estate, mirroring the relentless drumbeat of anxiety in Elisa's chest. The storm outside was nothing compared to the quiet, suffocating tempest within the walls of her father's mansion. She sat perfectly still before the vanity mirror, a small sponge pressed between her trembling fingers. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the bathroom offered no mercy, illuminating the grotesque canvas of her left cheekbone. It was a fresh mark, blooming in violent shades of plum and sickly yellow, the edges tracing the exact width of her father's signet ring. Elisa dipped the sponge into the heavy theatrical concealer. Dab, blend, breathe. It was a familiar rhythm, a survival tactic honed over 22 years of living under the shadow of Marcus Thorne. To the outside world, Marcus was a pillar of the community, a ruthless but respected corporate magnate, and the alpha of the eastern seaboard's most lucrative territory. To Elisa, he was the monster who lived down the hall. The heavy oak door to her bedroom clicked open. Elisa didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The sudden, freezing drop in the room's temperature, the faint scent of expensive cedar cologne and stale cigar smoke. It was him. "Are you finished painting yourself?" Marcus's voice was low, carrying the smooth, dangerous cadence of a predator sizing up a wounded animal. "Almost, Father," Elisa murmured. Her voice was a fragile thing, carefully stripped of any emotion that might provoke him. She applied another layer of powder, praying the overhead lights in the dining hall would wash out any remaining discoloration. Marcus stepped into the bathroom, his large frame entirely dwarfing the space. He wore a midnight blue bespoke suit, immaculate and pressed, projecting the image of absolute control. He reached out, his thick fingers grabbing her chin in a vice-like grip. He wrenched her face toward him, forcing her to look into his cold, slate-gray eyes. Elisa's breath caught. She kept her hands perfectly still in her lap, knowing that pulling away would only earn her a second strike. "Passable," he sneered, tossing her face back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "You listen to me carefully, Elisa. Tonight is not one of your insignificant charity galas. Alpha King David is not a man who tolerates weakness, and he certainly does not tolerate embarrassment. He is here to audit the Eastern Territory. If he finds a single flaw in my house, a single crack in the foundation of my leadership—" Marcus leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "I will make sure you don't wake up tomorrow. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Father," she whispered, her eyes fixed firmly on the marble floor. "You will speak only when spoken to. You will smile. You will be the perfect, obedient daughter that I have spent a fortune trying to mold you into." He straightened his cuffs, his expression smoothing into a mask of patriarchal benevolence. "Clean up the sink. You have 10 minutes before the convoy arrives." When he finally left, the silence in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Elisa exhaled a shaky breath, gripping the edges of the vanity until her knuckles turned white. She looked at her reflection. A beautiful, hollow girl stared back. Her dark hair was pinned into a flawless chignon, her emerald green evening gown draped perfectly over a frame that was slightly too thin, slightly too rigid. She was a porcelain doll, meticulously glued together, ready to be displayed. Elisa didn't know much about Alpha King David. In their insular, cutthroat society, a modern syndicate governed by ancient pharaoh laws of dominance and submission, the king was a ghost story whispered in boardrooms. He was a man who had ascended to the throne not through bloodline, but through absolute, unyielding conquest. They said he was merciless. They said he could smell a lie before it left a man's lips. If that was true, Elisa thought with a sickening jolt of panic, he would see right through her. He would look at the Thorne estate and smell the blood soaked into the floorboards. She stood up, smoothing the fabric of her dress over her bruised ribs. She couldn't afford to be afraid of a king she had never met. The only monster she needed to survive was the one waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. Raising her chin, she slipped on her silver heels, locked her trauma behind a deadened gaze, and walked out of her bedroom to play her part. The grand foyer of the Thorne estate hummed with a tense, manufactured elegance. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their notes completely drowned out by the thrumming anxiety radiating from the 40 elite guests Marcus had assembled. These were the high society wolves of the East, senators, CEOs, and local enforcers, all masquerading in designer gowns and tuxedos. Elisa stood a half step behind her father, a crystal flute of champagne clutched in her hand. She hadn't taken a sip. The liquid sloshed gently, betraying the slight tremor in her fingers. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a subtle change. The air pressure seemed to drop instantly, pressing heavily against the eardrums. The string quartet faltered, the cellist missing a beat. The low murmur of conversation evaporated into absolute, suffocating silence. The heavy front doors were opened by the estate staff. Alpha King David stepped over the threshold. He was not wearing a tuxedo. In a room full of men suffocating in silk ties and velvet lapels, the king wore a dark, tailored charcoal suit over a black shirt, the collar undone. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, the quiet, deliberate economy of motion belonging to a man who had never needed to rush, because the world simply waited for him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with raven black hair slightly damp from the rain. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Elisa's lungs. They were a piercing, striking amber, glowing with an intense, quiet intelligence. They were not the eyes of a brute. They were the eyes of an apex predator analyzing an ecosystem. Behind him flanked his detail. 4 massive, silent men who looked as though they could tear the mansion down brick by brick. But David commanded the space effortlessly. Marcus stepped forward, his usual arrogant swagger replaced by a stiff, almost desperate deference. "My king, welcome to my home. The Eastern Territory is honored by your presence." David stopped. He didn't immediately extend his hand. He let Marcia stand there, arm outstretched, for 3 agonizing seconds. The silence stretched so thin, Elisa thought it might snap. Finally, David took Marcus's hand, his grip casual but firm. "Marcus." David's voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the marble floors. "You have a beautiful home. Let's hope the ledgers are just as pristine." Marcus chuckled nervously, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. Of course. Allow me to introduce my daughter, Elisa." Elisa stepped forward, adhering perfectly to protocol. She kept her eyes lowered, fixing her gaze on the subtle pinstripe of David's suit. "It is an honor, Your Majesty," she murmured, executing a flawless, shallow curtsy. She expected him to nod and move on. Men of his stature rarely acknowledge the daughters of their subordinates, viewing them merely as bargaining chips for future alliances. But David didn't move. Elisa felt the weight of his amber gaze resting on her. It was heavy, probing, and utterly unnerving. She held her breath, her heart hammering wildly against her bruised ribs. Did he see the makeup? Did he smell the fear clinging to her like a second skin? "Look at me, Elisa," David commanded softly. It wasn't a request. Slowly, her hands trembling by her sides, she raised her head. For the first time, she met the king's eyes. There was no arrogance in them, no predatory lust that she was so accustomed to seeing in her father's associates. Instead, there was a sharp, clinical observation. He looked at her cheek. He looked at the rigid posture of her shoulders. He looked at the way she instinctively leaned away from her father. David's jaw tightened, an imperceptible shift that only someone used to reading microscopic signs of danger would notice. "She is very quiet, Marcus," David noted, his gaze never leaving Elisa's. "She is well-mannered, my king." Marcus interjected quickly, stepping slightly in front of Elisa as if to shield her from the king's scrutiny. "A traditional upbringing. We value obedience and grace in the East." "Do you?" David finally broke eye contact with Elisa, turning his attention back to Marcus. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "I value honesty. I find that obedience is often just fear wearing a pretty dress." Marcus swallowed hard, the muscles in his neck ticking. "A profound sentiment, my king. Shall we move to the dining hall? The staff has prepared a feast." As the group began to move, Elisa exhaled a shaky breath, falling into step behind them. Her mind was racing. For a fraction of a second, when David had looked at her, she hadn't felt like a porcelain doll. She had felt entirely, terrifyingly seen. And as she watched the broad span of the king's back as he walked into the dining hall, a dangerous, foreign thought flickered in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, her father had finally invited a monster into the house that was bigger than him. The dinner was an agonizing theater of lies. Marcus spent the entire 2 hours pouring vintage wine and spinning tales of the Eastern Territory's prosperity, inflating production numbers and emphasizing his unyielding control over the local packs. Throughout it all, Alpha King David sat at the head of the table, eating sparingly, listening intently, and saying very little. Elisa sat at her father's right hand, a perfect, silent statue. She only spoke twice, both times offering practiced, hollow answers about her philanthropic work, when one of the senators directed a question her way. But every time she looked up, she found David watching her. Not with the leering gaze of the other men, but with a dark, calculating intensity. He watched the way she gripped her fork. He watched the way she flinched, ever so slightly, when Marcus unexpectedly slammed his hand on the table to emphasize a point. David was piecing together a puzzle, and Elisa was terrified of what he would do when he saw the final picture. By midnight, the agonizing charade concluded. The guests departed into the stormy night, their luxury sedans splashing down the long driveway. David and his detail were shown to the guest wing, a separate building entirely, meant to afford the king maximum privacy. The moment the heavy front doors clicked shut, the manufactured warmth of the house vanished. Elisa stood in the foyer, her back aching from holding her rigid posture. She watched her father pour himself a massive glass of scotch. He didn't turn around. In my study. Now, Marcus growled. The command was a death sentence. Elisa's stomach plummeted. She had done everything right. She had smiled. She had been silent. What had she missed? What invisible tripwire had she crossed? She followed him down the long, shadowed hallway to the study, her silver heels sinking into the thick Persian rugs. The study was Marcus's sanctum, a room lined with heavy leather books he never read and hunting trophies he hadn't killed. It was soundproofed. It was where the real discipline happened. Marcus slammed the heavy oak doors shut behind her, throwing the deadbolt with a sharp, metallic clack. "You stupid, worthless girl," Marcus whispered, taking a slow, menacing step toward her. He set his scotch glass on the mahogany desk. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" "Father, I don't know what you mean," Elisa stammered, backing away until her spine hit the cold wood of the bookshelves. "The way you were looking at him," Marcus roared, his face contorting into a mask of pure fury. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, his hand shooting out to wrap around her throat. Elisa choked, her hands instinctively coming up to claw at his wrist. But it was like trying to move a steel beam. "You think because he's the king, he's going to save you?" Marcus spat, his spittle hitting her face. "You think he gives a damn about a broken second-rate bitch like you? You made me look weak tonight. You sat there trembling like a whipped cur while I was trying to secure our future." "I didn't," she gasped, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. Marcus threw her. Elisa hit the heavy mahogany desk, her hip colliding violently with the edge before she crashed to the marble floor. A sharp, blinding agony tore through her side, radiating up to her already bruised ribs. She cried out, the sound a pathetic, broken wheeze. "Get off the floor, Elisa. You're a disgrace." Marcus hissed, calmly reaching up to adjust his custom silk tie. He ignored the dark blood gathering at her split lip where her teeth had caught her flesh. Elisa tasted copper. The room was spinning. She pressed her trembling palms against the cold marble, desperately trying to find leverage, trying to obey the father who should have protected her. Every breath felt like jagged glass grinding in her chest. The facade was gone. The porcelain was shattered. I said, "Get up." Marcus raised his heavy hand again, stepping over her. Outside the study, in the silent, darkened hallway of the main house, a shadow detached itself from the wall. David hadn't gone to the guest wing. He had smelled the lie. He had smelled the fear. And now he smelled the blood. Marcus swung his hand down. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors splintered inward with a deafening crack. The reinforced wood, thick enough to stop a bullet, shattered as if hit by a mortar shell. Wood fragments rained across the Persian rug. The deadbolt sheared clean off the frame, pinging against the far wall. Alpha King David stepped through the ruins. The air in the room instantly turned toxic with suffocating, primal dominance. David's eyes were no longer amber. They were bleeding into a terrifying, luminous gold. He didn't look like a king auditing a ledger. He looked like the monster the ghost stories warned about. His dark, suffocating gaze locked onto Elisa's crumpled, bleeding form on the floor, absorbing the damage. Then, with terrifying slowness, his eyes shifted to Marcus. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still half raised, his face drained of all color. He was an alpha, but in the presence of the king, he was nothing but prey. "Drop your hand." David's voice was a seismic, terrifying rumble that shook the crystal decanters on the desk. "Or I will sever it from your wrist." The silence that followed the splintering of the heavy oak doors was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. It was the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic natural disaster. Marcus Thorne, the undisputed alpha of the Eastern Seaboard. The man who had terrorized Elisa for 22 years stood paralyzed. His hand, previously raised to strike her down, trembled violently in the air before slowly, agonizingly dropping to his side. Alpha King David did not yell. He did not need to. The sheer, suffocating weight of his presence filled the study, pressing against the walls, sucking the oxygen from the room. The air smelled sharp, like ozone and burning wire, the physical manifestation of an apex predator's lethal fury. "My king," Marcus stammered, the words scraping out of his suddenly dry throat. He took a stumbling step backward, his polished demeanor shattering into a million pathetic pieces. You misunderstand. This is a private family matter. Discipline." The girl was insolent. Under traditional pack law, an alpha's household is his own domain. "Pack law," David repeated, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated through the floorboards and into Elisa's aching bones. David took a slow step forward. The remaining shards of the wooden door crunched under his heavy boots. "You invoke the ancient laws to justify beating a woman half your size? You invoke my laws to protect your cowardice?" Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. But David's massive enforcers had already blocked the exit. There was nowhere to run. "She is my daughter. She is my property to manage until she is mated." The word property seemed to trigger a seismic shift in the room. David moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. In a fraction of a second, he crossed the room. He didn't throw a punch. He simply closed his hand around Marcus's throat and slammed the older man backward against the mahogany bookshelves. Heavy, leather-bound volumes rained down around them, crashing to the floor. But David didn't even blink. He lifted Marcus a full inch off the ground with one arm. Marcus clawed at David's wrist, his face turning a mottled, desperate shade of purple, his legs kicking uselessly. "Listen to me very carefully, Marcus," David said, his golden eyes glowing with a terrifying, ancient authority. "The era of men like you is over. You do not own her. You do not own this territory. As of this exact second, you are stripped of your rank, your assets, and your title. You will be confined to these grounds until my auditors finish tearing your life apart. If you try to run, my men will hunt you down." David threw Marcus to the floor like a piece of discarded trash. Marcus collapsed, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat, coughing violently onto his expensive Persian rug. Elisa watched the scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes. She was still pressed against the cold marble, her ribcage screaming in pain with every shallow breath. Her mind could not process the paradigm shift. Her father, the invincible monster of her nightmares, was on the ground, weeping and gasping like a broken child. Then, David turned his attention to her. Elisa instantly flinched, curling her body inward, throwing her hands over her head in a reflexive gesture of pure trauma. She had never known male power to be anything but a weapon. If David had just destroyed her father so effortlessly, what would he do to her? But the bone-crushing aura of dominance in the room suddenly vanished. The air cleared. The suffocating pressure lifted. Elisa heard the rustle of fabric. And then she felt a sudden, profound warmth draped over her shivering shoulders. She dared to peek through her arms. David had taken off his dark charcoal suit jacket and wrapped it around her, covering her torn, emerald-green gown and the bruising on her pale shoulders. He was kneeling on the floor in front of her, not towering, not threatening, just a man, bringing himself down to her eye level. "Elisa," he said softly. The baritone of his voice was no longer a weapon. It was a steady, grounding anchor. Look at me." Slowly, she lowered her hands. She met his eyes. They were no longer the terrifying gold of an enraged alpha, but the deep, quiet amber she had seen at dinner. "Can you stand?" he asked, his gaze flicking down to her ribs and then back to her face, assessing the damage with clinical, quiet rage. I think so," she whispered, her voice cracking. David didn't grab her arm or haul her up. He simply offered his hand, palm up. A choice. A gesture she had never been afforded in this house. "You are leaving with me," David stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate, yet devoid of cruelty. "You will never step foot in this house again." Elisa looked at his large, scarred hand. For a moment, the world hung suspended. She was terrified of him. She was terrified of the unknown. But as she looked at her father, still groveling on the floor, she realized she was far more terrified of staying. With a trembling hand, she reached out and placed her palm in the king's. His grip was warm, impossibly strong, and as he gently pulled her to her feet, for the first time in her life, Elisa felt the terrifying, fragile spark of hope. The walk from the study to the front doors of the Thorne estate felt like a surreal, out-of-body experience. Elisa leaned heavily against the solid wall of David's side, his arm remaining a respectful but firm brace behind her back to keep her steady. The suffocating weight of his charcoal suit jacket smelled of rain, cedar, and an underlying scent of pure, clean earth. It was completely foreign compared to the stale cigar smoke that permeated her father's home. The estate staff, usually invisible ghosts sliding along the walls, had gathered at the edges of the grand foyer. They watched in stunned, breathless silence as the Alpha King escorted their broken mistress out the front door, leaving the shattered remnants of their master behind. Elisa kept her eyes locked on the floor. She didn't want to see the pity in the maid's eyes, nor the shock on the security guards' faces. She just wanted the heavy, suffocating air of the mansion behind her. As they stepped out into the night, the storm had escalated. The wind howled, whipping the heavy rain in sideways sheets. Before the first drop could hit Elisa's battered face, one of David's massive enforcers smoothly stepped forward, snapping open a large black umbrella, shielding them both from the elements. A fleet of armored black SUVs idled in the circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the deluge. David guided her toward the center vehicle. The door was opened, and she climbed inside, sinking into the plush, dark leather. The ambient temperature was perfectly warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. David slid in beside her, and the door slammed shut with a heavy, final thud, sealing them inside a soundproof vault on wheels. The convoy began to move immediately, tires hissing on the wet asphalt, carrying her away from the only hell she had ever known. The silence inside the cabin was thick. Elisa sat rigidly, her hands tightly clutching the lapels of David's jacket, drawing it closer around her ruined dress. She stared out the tinted window at the passing trees, watching the wrought iron gates of the Thorne estate vanish into the darkness. She expected an interrogation. She expected him to demand gratitude, to lay out the terms of her new imprisonment. In her world, powerful men did not save women out of the goodness of their hearts. They traded them. They acquired them. She was a valuable asset, the daughter of a prominent alpha, even a disgraced one. But David said nothing. He sat comfortably on his side of the spacious back seat, giving her the entire width of the cabin. He opened a small compartment, retrieved a bottle of water, twisted the cap, and held it out to her. Elisa flinched slightly at the sudden movement, but forced herself to take it. "Thank you," she rasped. "Drink it slowly," he advised, his eyes watching the way her hands shook. She took a small sip. The cool water felt like a balm on her split lip and dry throat. When she lowered the bottle, she found David still watching her. The clinical assessment was back, but there was a profound, quiet anger swimming beneath the amber of his irises. It wasn't directed at her. "I know what you are thinking, Elisa," David said smoothly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, competing with the hum of the engine. "You do?" she whispered, her pulse quickening. "You are trying to calculate the cost," he stated bluntly. He shifted slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing himself a fraction closer, though still maintaining a strict physical boundary. "You are wondering what currency I will demand in exchange for taking you out of that house. You are wondering what kind of cage I am bringing you to." Elisa's breath caught. He had surgically extracted her deepest, darkest fear in 3 sentences. She looked down at her hands, unable to maintain eye contact with a man who could see right through her carefully constructed porcelain mask. "I am a realist, Your Majesty," she managed to say, the diplomatic training kicking in. "A survivalist," David corrected gently. "There is a difference. A realist accepts the world as it is. A survivalist does whatever it takes to live to the next day." He leaned back against the leather headrest, his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights. The sharp angles of his jaw, the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow, he looked every bit the warrior king the rumors claimed him to be. Yet, he was entirely at ease. "You are not a hostage, Elisa," David continued, his tone carrying the absolute weight of a royal decree. "You are not collateral, and you are not a bargaining chip. Marcus Thorne is finished. His territory will be divided and his assets seized. You owe me nothing." Elisa frowned, her brows knitting together, a sharp pain pulsing in her bruised cheekbone as she did. "Then, why?" David turned his head, his amber eyes locking onto hers. The intensity of his gaze was staggering. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. "Because I despise men who build their empires on the broken backs of those they are meant to protect," he said softly, the words laced with a quiet, dangerous venom. "And because nobody deserves to bleed on their own floor." Elisa had no response to that. Her throat tightened, a sudden, unfamiliar burning prickling behind her eyes. For 22 years, she had been trained to swallow her tears, to hide her pain beneath heavy theatrical concealer and fake smiles. But sitting in the back of the king's car, cloaked in his jacket, the exhaustion of a lifetime of surviving suddenly crashed down upon her. She turned her face toward the window, pulling his jacket tighter. And for the first time since she was a little girl, Elisa allowed herself to quietly cry in the presence of a man. David didn't speak. He didn't offer hollow comforts. He simply let the heavy hum of the engine drown out her quiet sobs, offering her the one thing she desperately needed: the dignity of a safe silence. The sky was bleeding into a bruised, pale gray dawn by the time the convoy passed through the massive steel gates of the king's sanctuary. Elisa had drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep against the cold glass of the window, jolting awake every time the SUV hit a rough patch of road. When the vehicle finally rolled to a stop, she blinked against the morning light, her body aching with a profound, deep-seated soreness. The adrenaline had completely worn off, leaving behind the stark, brutal reality of her injuries. She looked out the window. She had expected a fortress, a dark, imposing citadel befitting the ruthless Alpha King. Instead, they were parked in front of a sprawling, architectural masterpiece of glass, dark wood, and natural stone, nestled deep within a dense, ancient pine forest. It felt less like a stronghold, and more like an extension of the earth itself. There were no visible guards patrolling the perimeter with automatic weapons, no imposing statues of snarling wolves. It was terrifyingly serene. The door opened. David stood there, the early morning light catching the gold flecks in his eyes. "We're here," he said quietly. Elisa gathered her strength, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through her bruised hip, and stepped out. The air here was crisp, smelling of wet pine and mountain soil, completely devoid of the city's smog and her father's suffocating cologne. David led her up the wide stone steps and into the house. The interior was vast and open, bathed in natural light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. The decor was minimalist, functional, yet undeniably expensive. An older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back into a neat braid was waiting in the foyer. She wore simple slacks and a soft sweater. "This is Martha," David introduced. "She runs the household. She will show you to your room and bring you whatever you need." "Welcome, child," Martha said, her voice warm and maternal. Her eyes briefly flicked to the bruising on Elisa's face, but she offered no gasp of horror, no intrusive questions. "Let's get you upstairs. You look like you could use a hot shower and a soft bed." Elisa looked back at David, suddenly feeling a surge of panic. The idea of being separated from him, the only person who had ever stopped the violence, was unexpectedly terrifying. "I will be down the hall in my office," David said, catching the subtle shift in her posture, the tightening of her grip on his jacket. "No one will enter your room without your permission. You have my word." His word. In her world, an alpha's word was a binding contract, sealed in blood. Elisa gave a small, jerky nod and followed Martha up the floating oak staircase. The guest room was massive, decorated in soothing tones of cream and slate. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and a massive bed piled high with down comforters dominated the center of the room. But what caught Elisa's attention was the door. As Martha showed her the ensuite bathroom, Elisa subtly checked the door mechanism. There was a heavy deadbolt on the inside. There was no keyhole on the outside. It could only be locked by the person within. There are fresh clothes in the closet. Mostly simple things, Martha said, setting a stack of fluffy white towels on the vanity. "I will bring up a tray of food and some ice packs in 30 minutes. Lock the door behind me if it makes you feel better, sweet girl." Martha offered a gentle, understanding smile and left, pulling the heavy doors shut with a soft click. Elisa stood alone in the center of the room. The silence here was different from the silence at her father's estate. It wasn't the silence of held breath and impending violence. It was just quiet. With trembling fingers, she reached out and turned the deadbolt. The heavy metallic clack echoed in the room. She was locked in, but for the first time in her life, she was keeping the monsters out. She walked into the bathroom and stood before the mirror. The harsh daylight pouring through the frosted window was unforgiving. Her porcelain mask was completely gone. Her left cheek was a swollen, dark purple mess. Her lip was split and crusted with dried blood. Her perfectly pinned chignon had fallen apart, dark strands of hair hanging wildly around her face. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck. Slowly, she shrugged off David's heavy jacket, folding it neatly and placing it on the vanity. She unzipped the ruined emerald gown, letting it pool around her ankles, a discarded symbol of a life she was leaving behind. The bruising on her ribs and hip was extensive, angry dark marks blooming across her pale skin, a map of her father's tyranny. She stepped into the shower, turning the water as hot as she could stand. The heat stung her bruised flesh, but she welcomed it. She grabbed a washcloth and scrubbed violently at her face, washing away the layers of expensive theatrical concealer, watching the beige water spiral down the drain. She scrubbed until her skin was raw, washing away Marcus Thorne, washing away the obedience, washing away the fear. When she finally stepped out, wrapped in a thick, warm robe Martha had left behind, there was a soft, tentative knock at the bedroom door. "Elisa," David's voice called through the heavy wood. "It's David. I have your food." Elisa tied the robe tightly around her waist. She walked to the door, her hand hovering over the deadbolt. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She was terrified, broken, and lost in a world she didn't understand. But as she threw the deadbolt and pulled the door open to look at the Alpha King, she caught her reflection in the full-length mirror. She was bruised, yes. She was battered. But beneath the swelling and the purple marks, there was a tiny, fierce spark in her emerald eyes that Marcus Thorne had never managed to beat out of her, a spark that the king had just given oxygen to. Elisa stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the edge of the heavy oak frame so tightly her knuckles shone white. Alpha King David stood in the hallway, holding a silver tray laden with a steaming bowl of roasted root vegetable soup, thick slices of crusty artisan bread, and a pot of chamomile tea. He had changed out of his formal suit into a simple, dark, long-sleeved Henley that stretched across his broad shoulders. Without the armor of his bespoke tailoring, he looked less like a mythic monarch and more like a man. But the raw, magnetic power radiating from him was entirely undiminished. "May I come in?" David asked. His voice was low, careful not to echo too loudly in the quiet corridor. He didn't push past her. He didn't presume entry. He waited for her verbal consent. Elisa swallowed the lump in her throat and took a half step back, pulling the door open a fraction wider. "Yes, please." David stepped into the room, his gaze briefly sweeping the space to ensure the fire was still burning and the curtains were drawn. He walked over to the small sitting area by the window and set the heavy tray down on the circular mahogany table. He didn't look at the massive, empty bed, and he didn't crowd her space. "Martha made the soup," David said, turning back to face her. He kept a deliberate distance of at least 6 feet between them. "She insisted you need warmth from the inside out. I agree with her." Elisa remained near the door, her arms wrapped defensively around her waist, clutching the thick fabric of her robe. In her father's house, meals were battlegrounds. Marcus had monitored every calorie she consumed, demanding she maintain the impossibly slender, fragile figure he deemed appropriate for his property. Food was a weapon, a reward, or a punishment. She looked at the hearty, rich meal steaming on the table, and a wave of overwhelming apprehension washed over her. I don't know if I can eat all of that, Your Majesty," she whispered, her eyes darting to his face, expecting the flash of irritation she was so accustomed to seeing in men when their provisions were refused. David's expression remained perfectly calm, though a muscle in his jaw twitched slightly, the only outward sign of his simmering anger at what had been done to her. "You don't have to eat all of it, Elisa. You don't have to eat any of it if your stomach isn't ready. It is an offering, not a mandate. And please, when it is just us, call me David." Elisa blinked, completely thrown off balance by the gentleness of his directive. She slowly released her death grip on her robe and took a tentative step toward the table. The smell of the rich broth and fresh herbs hit her senses, and her stomach gave a loud, hollow rumble, betraying her starvation. A deep flush of embarrassment crept up her neck. David offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It transformed his face, softening the harsh, lethal angles of his jawline. "Sit down, Elisa. Eat what you can. I will leave you to it." He turned to leave, walking back toward the open doorway. As he passed her, the clean, masculine scent of pine and rain washed over her again, making her breath catch. "Wait," she said softly. The word slipped out before she could stop it. David stopped instantly, turning his head to look at her. He didn't step closer, merely waited for her to find her words. "Why did you bring it up yourself?" she asked, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "You are the king. You have staff. You have Martha. You didn't have to carry a tray up a flight of stairs for a disgraced alpha's daughter." The ambient light from the fireplace caught the golden flecks in David's amber eyes. He looked at her with a profound, piercing intensity that made her heart hammer wildly against her bruised ribs. Yet strangely, it did not make her want to run. "Because, Elisa," David said quietly, his baritone voice wrapping around her like a heavy, protective blanket, "I needed you to see that the hands that broke your father's empire are also capable of simply serving you soup. I needed you to know that power does not always equate to violence." He stepped out into the hallway, pausing with his hand on the brass doorknob. "Lock the deadbolt behind me," David instructed gently. "Rest. The world will still be here tomorrow." He pulled the doors shut with a soft click. Elisa stood frozen in the center of the room for a long moment, the silence wrapping around her. Slowly, she walked over to the door and turned the heavy deadbolt, the metallic sound ringing with finality. Then she walked to the table, sat down, and for the first time in years, she ate a meal without tasting fear. 4 days passed in a haze of quiet healing. The angry purple bruising on Elisa's cheekbone had faded to a sickly yellow-green, and the sharp, agonizing pain in her ribs had dulled to a deep ache. Martha had been a constant, gentle presence, bringing her fresh clothes, soft cashmere sweaters and loose-fitting trousers that didn't press against her injuries. But David had given her complete space. She hadn't seen him since the first morning. He had kept his word, allowing her to dictate the pace of her recovery without the pressure of his overwhelming presence. By the afternoon of the 5th day, the suffocating isolation of the bedroom, though safe, began to feel like a different kind of cage. Elisa needed to move. She needed to know what was happening in the world outside her locked door. Dressed in a cream-colored sweater and dark slacks, she tentatively unlocked her door and stepped out into the hallway. The sanctuary was quiet, filled with the soft ambient light of the late afternoon sun filtering through the massive windows. She walked softly down the floating oak staircase, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood. As she reached the ground floor, she heard the low, serious murmur of voices coming from a pair of heavy double doors at the end of the east wing. David's office. She shouldn't eavesdrop. Her father would have backhanded her for even lingering near his study. But a morbid, desperate curiosity pulled her forward. She needed to know what was happening to Marcus. Elisa stopped a few feet from the partially open doors, pressing her back against the cool stone wall. "The Thorn accounts in the Caymans are heavily encrypted," a gruff, unfamiliar male voice was saying. "We've seized the physical assets in the East. But the liquid capital, the funds he's been skimming from the packed tithes, are locked behind a ghost ledger. If we can't find the cipher, that money is gone, my king." "Keep the cyber team on it," David's voice replied, sharp, authoritative, and entirely different from the gentle tone he had used with her. Marcus was arrogant, not brilliant. He would have kept the cipher close. Look for analog records. He didn't trust the cloud. Elisa closed her eyes. Her heart pounded. She knew exactly where the cipher was. She had seen him use it 100 times while she sat silently in the corner of his study, playing the invisible, perfect daughter. She had a choice. She could retreat to her room, stay safe, and remain a passive victim of her circumstances. Or she could step into the light. Elisa took a deep breath, her ribs aching in protest, and stepped into the open doorway. The office was massive, lined with dark wood bookshelves and centered around a massive slab of raw-edge walnut that served as a desk. David sat behind it, flanked by two heavily scarred enforcers. The moment she appeared, the conversation died instantly. The two enforcers tensed, their eyes locking onto her. David raised a single hand, a silent command that instantly stand down his men. His amber eyes fixed on her, calculating but entirely calm. "Elisa," David said, his tone neutral. "You are out of your room." I know where it is," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but she forced herself to keep her chin level. She refused to look at the floor. She looked directly into the king's eyes. David leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the desk. What is? "The cipher. For the Cayman accounts." She stepped fully into the room, her hands clutching the hem of her sweater. "My father is traditional. He believes digital records can be manipulated. He kept a false bottom drawer in the humidor on his desk. The sequence is hidden inside the bands of the Cohiba cigars. The serial numbers correspond to the encryption keys." The silence in the room was absolute. The two enforcers stared at her in stunned disbelief. David's eyes widened a fraction, a flash of genuine, unmasked surprise crossing his features. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a broken girl who needed saving, but as a razor-sharp intellect that had been deliberately suppressed. He turned his head slightly to his left lieutenant. "Send a team to the Thorne estate immediately. Tear apart the humidor." The enforcer nodded sharply and practically sprinted from the room, the other following closely behind, pulling the heavy double doors shut and leaving Elisa alone with the king. David stood up slowly, walking around the massive desk. He didn't approach her directly. He moved to the window, looking out at the pine forest, giving her space to breathe. "He thought you were just a decoration," David said softly, the anger in his voice directed entirely at Marcus. He had a brilliant tactical mind sitting in his study, and he used it as a prop to impress other fools. "I was a ghost," Elisa corrected quietly. "Ghosts hear everything." David turned back to face her, the sunlight catching the fierce, undeniable admiration in his eyes. "You are not a ghost anymore, Elisa. You just handed me the key to dismantle the rest of his empire and return millions to the packs he starved." He stepped a fraction closer, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum that made her pulse race. "I told you that you didn't owe me anything. But you just paid a king's ransom." For the first time in her life, looking into the eyes of an alpha, Elisa didn't feel fear. She felt powerful. Elisa's journey from a battered, silenced daughter to a formidable, brilliant woman discovering her own power is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She didn't just survive the monster in her home. She found a king who recognized her scars not as weaknesses, but as battle armor. Their slow-burn romance is built on the profound dismantling of trauma, replacing fear with unwavering respect and mutual strength. The Alpha King rose to shatter her physical cage, but Elisa rose to claim her throne. If this intense, emotional journey of survival, justice, and undeniable romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please give this video a like. Share it with fellow lovers of high-stakes supernatural drama, And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic, cinematic stories of shattered chains and fierce, protective love.